Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about the microchip, which is truly the dynamo that drives the digital revolution. We've talked about how the digital revolution is based on the concept of on-off switches being used in circuits so that logic can be done through the way of turning a switch on, off, and doing logical algebra with it. Initially, those switches were regular old click-clack switches, then electromagnetic switches like phone use, and eventually you get the vacuum tube, which is just a switch, but it does it electronically, meaning it switches on and off the flow of electrons, which means that it can happen thousands of times faster than a real mechanical switch. Then we talked about at Bell Labs, how they've invented a transistor, which is just a tiny piece of semiconducting material like silicon that has in it a little bit of doping or impurity, so it becomes an on-off switch. Well, the next advance is called the microchip, and that is simply etching thousands, maybe millions of transistors on a tiny piece of semiconducting material like silicon. When they built ENIAC, it had 17,000 vacuum tubes. Pretty bad because they burn out like at the rate of 1 or 2 per hour. And then the transistor gets developed, and in a small pocket device the size of a deck of cards, you had 6 transistors to make a transistor radio, or you can make a calculator with 12 transistors. Nowadays, it's gotten smaller and better because those transistors are on microchips, and there are 8.5 billion transistors in my iPhone, all because of the invention of the integrated circuit, which is pretty much driven by a wonderful guy named Bob Noyce. He was from Iowa. He was a total golden boy. His father was a congregational minister and used to travel from church to church in Iowa. The family had to move quite often when his father would get assigned to a new church. So Bob Noyce learned the art of making new friends, but also keeping the old. He had a high wattage smile. And from his father's church, the Congregationalist Church, he learned the idea of working together. Because Congregationalists, it's a denomination, a Christian denomination, that's very much reformist. It was part of the Puritans and reformers who reformed the Church of England and got rid of the vestiges of the Catholic Church, which mainly included hierarchy and all sorts of, organization of from the Pope to the archbishops and cardinals, all the way down to the bishops and priests. Well, in the Congregational Church, there's no altar. There's no railing separating the congregation from the minister. It's all done in unison. And that was a type of plan, that type of organizational structure, that sort of open floor plan even, that Bob Noyce eventually brings to Silicon Valley, and particularly his company, Intel. He had an aversion for hierarchy and loved this notion of decentralized authority that you found in Congregationalist churches. He had a great, smile, infectious grin, athletic body, and he was a real heartthrob. He also had something that Steve Jobs learned how to do, which is the ability to stare at people without blinking. He grew up with something that kids these days I don't think have as much as they should. I used to have it when I was growing up, and that's a workshop in the basement of your home where you could take things apart. I remember taking apart radios and TVs, soldering circuits. Nowadays, most electronic devices are tightly sealed. Your iPhone, your computer, you can't really open them up. But Bob Noyce loved to work in his basement workshop and take things apart and learn how the innards of a computer, the innards of a television set or a radio work. He also created a wonderful hang glider that he used behind his car, once jumped off the roof of a barn with it. And he was one of those all-around great students when he goes to Grinnell College, where his father is finally assigned to a church in Grinnell, and there's a wonderful college in that beautiful town. And Bob Noyce becomes the star there. He derives every formula from scratch in his physics class. He becomes on the swimming team a championship diver. He plays oboe in the college band. He sings chorus. He designed circuits for the model airplane club and even played in the radio soap operas that they did. But despite this, he was well liked, partly, I think, because of that madrigal singing quality. He loved getting people together. He wasn't somebody who asserted himself as a leader. He just sort of brought people together to do things. Once he volunteered to even procure the pig for a luau. They took one from a neighborhood farmer, and Noyce, in a feeling of guilt, admitted to the authorities the next day that he had done that, and he even got suspended from college for a while, but that didn't hurt his career. He ends up going to MIT, partly because his college at Grinnell, his teacher, a guy named Professor Gale, had been able to procure a transistor. He knew somebody at Bell Labs, and so he gets one of the first transistors they built in Bell Labs, and Bob Noyce becomes transformed by it. He said it was one of those ideas that just jolts the guts out of you. And so he ends up going to MIT so he can study electrical engineering and figuring it out. He ends up, Bob Noyce does, working in Philadelphia for a while, and then he gets a phone call from William Shockley. Shockley was one of those three we talked about last lecture who invents the transistor at Bell Labs, along with Walter Brattain and John Bardeen. But William Shockley was really hard to get along with, was paranoid, eventually descends into pure madness and racism. But even back then, he was somebody who nobody at Bell Labs ever wanted to work with again. So when Shockley moves back to his native California, to Silicon Valley, then really an Apricot Valley, hasn't yet become Silicon Valley, he can't recruit any of the people from Bell Labs, so he just calls up cold the people he's been told are the best young engineers. And of course, he calls Robert Noyce, who is so interested in the idea of the transistor that when the inventor of the transistor calls him up, Bob Noyce not only accepts, he gets in his car in Philadelphia and drives for 2 straight days to get to California to celebrate at Shockley Semiconductor Lab. They were having a party for new recruits. Noyce gets there, it's 10 p.m., he's unshaven. Shockley is doing a tango with a rose in his mouth. And this new young kid, Bob Noyce, comes in, picks up the punch bowl, drinks the entire bowl of spiked punch, and then passes out. And one of the engineers said, this is going to be a whole lot of fun. Another person who Shockley recruited was a guy named Gordon Moore. You've probably heard of him because of Moore's Law. Moore's Law says that the processing power of a circuit, the amount of transistors it has, will double every 2 years, and the price will come down in half every couple of years. Now, that's not really a law. It's something that has to be created by humans. Humans have to make this law into a reality. And that's what happens when Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore, they're the two of them, Gordon Moore sitting down with the pencil in his hand, become a team at Shockley Semiconductor. They work with Shockley for a while. They're celebrating the Nobel Prize that Shockley has just won. Shockley's sort of at the bottom right, wearing those glasses. But that was the last great celebration at Shockley Semiconductor. After he wins the Nobel Prize, Shockley becomes even more paranoid. And what happens is Bob Noyce is front and center there with Gordon Moore on the far left, become part of what's called the Traitorous Eight. One day they just simply announce they're leaving Shockley Semiconductor and they're forming their own company called Fairchild Semiconductor. Eventually it morphs into what is now known as Intel. And one of the things they do is they take on what's called the tyranny of numbers, because transistors are really cool and you can put a whole lot of them on a circuit board, but at a certain point, you solder a lot of transistors and other components onto a circuit board, and the tyranny of numbers kicks in. Say you have 10,000 components that you're trying to put on a circuit board. That may be 100,000 wires that you have to solder. Well, something's going to go wrong if you do that. So in 2 different places, they invent a process for making it so that you can put a lot of transistors onto one single piece of silicon and thus not have all that problem, all the squiggly little wires that you have to solder together. The way they did it at Fairchild with Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce, there's Bob Noyce holding an oversized model of what becomes the integrated circuit or microchip, was because they faced the problem that there was a whole lot of impurities and that the transistors and circuits that they made were getting messed up. So they created a shellac or a varnish that you could put on top of it, but you could make little holes or etchings in that varnish cover and thus put the impurities that you wanted, the doping, onto the silicon chip. Once they did that, they and their patent lawyers figured out, wow, you can use this planar process to just etch whatever you want on a piece of silicon in tiny, very accurate ways. So you could put a lot of transistors and other components like capacitors or resistors on it. Likewise, you have at Texas Instruments a wonderful guy named Jack Kilby. Now, we mentioned him before because he's working with Pat Haggerty at this Texas Instruments, an old oil field exploration place, and they get a license for the Bell Labs to make transistors. Initially, they make that first transistor radio, but Jack Kilby, when he starts working there, has an idea that using different forms of impurities that you can etch into a silicon chip, you can create every component you might want in a circuit. You can create a transistor by doing a semiconducting piece of boron that switches on and off. You can make a resistor so that the electrons won't flow. You can make a capacitor so it would hold a charge. And you can etch all these things into one little piece of silicon. Anyway, both of them come together to create at Texas Instruments and then at what becomes Intel, the notion of the microchip. There was one other innovation that comes along too, and that's venture capital. Arthur Rock, a friend of Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce from the East Coast, comes west. He's been a banker, and he figures out, I can raise money from investors, and we become angel investors. And that's how they help start all these companies in Silicon Valley. Gordon Moore on the far right, Bob Noyce in the middle. But in order to create a great team, you need different types of talent. And on the far left, there's Andy Grove. So when they create Intel, you got Bob Noyce as a leader. He hates confrontation. Sweetest guy in the world. He builds a big open workspace as if it were a congregational church. His desk is in the middle, a beat up old desk. Anybody can walk up to him. Next to his desk is that of Gordon Moore, the two leaders of the firm. There's no hierarchy. It's like a congregational church. At one point, somebody says, what's our org chart? And Noyce just drew a little circle and said, here's a dot in the middle. That's you. The org chart is here's everybody else. When you want to connect with them, just go talk to them. That's great, but it doesn't necessarily make for the most disciplined of organizations. So as part of the team, they hire Andy Grove, that impish-looking guy on the far left. Andy Grove grew up in Hungary. His family survives the Nazis. Then he, as a young kid, escapes the communists by swimming across a river while he's chased by troops. This is not growing up in a congregational minister's family in Iowa. This is not sweet madrigal singing. This becomes a background for a really driven, tough, disciplinarian guy. And he writes a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And that's the type of person, too, you need with somebody like a Noyce and a Moore. You also need somebody who can impose discipline, get the microchips out the door. And that was the hierarchy at Intel. Eventually, the invention of the Nobel Prize, the invention of the microchip wins the Nobel Prize. By that point, Bob Noyce has died, and there's Jack Kilby. Jack Kilby and Noyce had been involved in a lawsuit between Texas Instruments and Intel about the patent for the microchip. But at one point, Kilby and Noyce just speak by phone and said, let's get the lawyers out of the way. They sort of on a handshake agree to settle the cases, cross-license their patents, and to become very cooperative. So when Kilby gets the Nobel Prize, the first thing he says after the King of Sweden gives it to him is, if Bob Noyce were alive today, he'd be standing here with me. And the head of the Swedish Academy introducing Jack Kilby for his speech says, Jack Kilby, your invention of the microchip helped create the entire digital revolution we're going through today. And Kilby tells the story of the beaver sitting at the foot of the Hoover Dam talking to a rabbit. And the beaver says to the rabbit, "No, I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." It was that type of collaborative spirit that becomes part of the digital revolution. Thanks.